This is my research book for concept to creation. This is my opening page, and I'm looking at women in the 19th century and how they felt oppressed and alienated and all of the different attributes that came with being a Victorian woman during this time. First, I decided to look into Victorian literature and poetry. This poem is called From the Antique and is by Christina Rossetti. I picked out 2 lines in this which I thought were quite prominent. It goes, "I wish and I wish I were a man, or better than being, were not." The lines seem to say that life being a weary experience is an absolute, but somehow is made worse when the person living it is female. Here I'm looking at prominent Victorian figures and looking at colour portrayed in the pre-Raphaelites artwork in Victorian Silhouettes. The pre-Raphaelites were an artistic movement that challenged social conventions of the time. They took ideas from literature and were immersed in nature. Incidentally, the author of From the Antique is the sister of one of the artists in the pre-Raphaelites Brotherhood. Here are some preliminary sketches from the silhouettes. I'm looking at trims and ribbons and shapes they created within the garments. I've also been influenced by Jane Eyre, which was a novel written by Charlotte Bronte in 1847 and was adapted into a film. I was looking at some of the clothings and the trims from that costume. Here I've done some primary research into flower trends for Spring/Summer 21. I've used oil pastel for this because it adds a little bit of texture to the page, and I've also explored floral print as a starting point from some garden flowers. I've also then started looking at how I can transfer some of these colours into lace and liven them up a little bit, because they started off as quite plain white lace. Next, I decided to look at the texture of the lace and broderie. I've used different paperweights as well, just to kind of explore this further, and an acetone print on the far right side. I was further exploring a Victorian shape and silhouette and looking at the forecasted trend colours. I was also looking at Sakai and J.W. Anderson for their silhouette shapes. Here are some more preliminary sketches. I'm experimenting with a bit of lace and colour here. Next, I started incorporating some of the more muted toned colours into the lace and a little bit more development with some beading within the lace. Here is a technique called shibori, and it's where you're using the heat press to flatten the fabric through some of the card with the slits in, and it creates a abstract pattern. It's a bit more of a shift in tone, and I was also exploring some flowers, and the bluebell here means humility in the Victorian language of flowers. I then started looking at how clear materials can be translated into a garment, as this is another trend for Spring/Summer 21. I was interested in the way it moves and how it reflects light, and also how I can use this to my advantage with ruffle and layering. Here I was also starting to look at how the male silhouette has influenced women's garments. Here is some further research into garments that incorporate some sheer fabrics and ruffles and how they can be used. This is some sleeve development. Here are some examples of stand development with some old toiles from Fashion Industry Part 1. You'll see what volume I could make on the arms. Then I started exploring textures within the florals and how I can incorporate beading and paint. I was further looking at the male silhouette here as well. I was then experimenting with the sheer fabric to kind of replicate the ruffled look. Another influence is Anna Karenina, written by Leo Tolstoy. He depicts the delicacy of a woman and her mental states throughout this film. I was looking at the use of layering in the costume used and the Victorian use of trim placement. I was looking at how to create texture and volume within this look. Using a lightweight fabric and sewn lines across, it is then placed in a mini oven and it shrinks to create this gathered look. I was playing around with the sheer fabrics and how I can get some gathers out of that. Again, I was looking at male silhouette influences and the trousers and the collar styles. I wanted to be able to claim the trim, claim the lace as much as I could claim a cloth, so I added some beads here. These next few pages look at Aurora Lee as my muse. She's the main character of a blank verse poem written by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Aurora recognises that in her patriarchal society, women were little more than tools to convenience their husbands. These words spoken by Elizabeth Barrett Browning show that women were capable of realising that they were being wronged and taken advantage of, which meant that they were not as mentally incapable as they were portrayed and thought to be. It was a very controversial poem of its time. It led to great criticism in the press as it was about new ideas involving gender. Over the next few pages, I've given my own interpretation through illustration. This has enabled me to develop my own silhouettes. I have then gathered my own primary research into family and shapes and silhouettes that have been created in these images. I conducted some market research in Zara to see what types of blouses and shirts were looking like at the minute. And then I used a bit of newspaper to create a collage of some toile developments, a different approach to this method. The effect is quite pleasing and you're able to see the different shapes you can get with sort of ruffles and volume within this top half of the garment. These next couple of pages are just some designs on the stand that have been drawn instead of using a 3D approach. And these are my initial lineup designs. These aren't coloured in as I wanted to try and perfect the shape first, but you can see the fabrics and the trims on the next couple of pages, and I added the colours too. The first fabric is the crepe de chine, the next one is Duchess satin, then the baby cord, and then the lace, and then the organza. And then this is the hand-drawn full lineup. Moving on now to toile development and how I adjusted the trousers to fit a bit more tapered, and also how I was trying to get the correct fit of the collar and the yoke so it fit really seamlessly against the neck and on the chest and back. This took quite a few attempts, but I finally got the one to fit perfectly. Here are some pictures of the final toiles, front view, back view, side view, and some cuffs and details. And then some notes on what needs adjusting, so for example, to lower the waistband in height, line increases, add a couple more tucks and darts, and to add belt loops. I decided to experiment with a more abstract way of colouring lace, so Some of these have watercolours on, the first two, and one's a bit more diluted than the other, and you can definitely see which one is more effective. On the next page I experimented with the lace with some satin stitch and some embroidery with beading. In order to get some muted tones that would match the final lineup, I decided to experiment with some natural dyeing techniques. Some were definitely more effective than others. For example, the beetroot was probably the strongest and most pigmented of them all. Due to this whole COVID situation, I thought, why not just use what I have at home? So instead of going out and buying or trying to order fabric dyes, I decided to use what I had in the cupboards. Due to the lack of having university printers available, I decided to illustrate my final looks. Obviously there's photos in the lookbook, but here are the final drawings, the final outcome.